Welcome to the K in Clarity podcast. I'm the host, Mezue. During this episode, we're joined by Shawnnah Monterrey, founder and CEO of Beanstock Ventures. Shawnnah Monterrey has been instrumental in advancing medical device development and regulatory strategy within the healthcare technology and life sciences space. With over 20 years of experience, she has led complex global product development programs and software quality assurance for medical instruments, diagnostics, and clinical applications at leading companies such as Illumina, Covidien, Invitech, and Carl Zeiss Meditech. Monterrey founded Beanstock Ventures in 2018, an FDA-accredited third-party 510K review organization and venture studio focused on fast-tracking medical device innovation. Under her leadership, Beanstock Ventures has successfully incubated multiple companies, secured long-term partnerships with Fortune 500 firms, and developed customized regulatory and compliance services that help startups navigate the increasingly complex FDA space, especially in digital health and AI-driven medical technologies. In this conversation, we discuss the intersection of AI and medical devices, the importance of regulatory strategy, and the challenges faced by startups in the healthcare space. We also explore the role of data diversity in diagnostics, the significance of reimbursement codes, and the need for a commercialization plan. Shawnnah emphasizes the importance of integrating regulatory strategy into business planning and the future of technology in healthcare, including patient empowerment and the convergence of AI, VR, and robotics. If this is your first time tuning in, here's the gist. The healthcare industry is buzzing with innovations, but there's a lot of noise and misconceptions out there. That's where we come in. Because of my experience in the healthcare ecosystem, I've gained a unique vantage point into the industry's inner workings. We're bringing you the conversations that typically happen behind boardrooms and strategy sessions, the real challenges, innovative solutions, and game-changing insights that are reshaping healthcare as we know it. On this podcast, we're bringing you face-to-face with the industry's leading healthcare founders, executives, and innovators. We're talking about the nitty-gritty of building and scaling healthcare companies, the hurdles they've overcome, and the strategies that have led to their success. More importantly, we dive into the personal challenges that come with trying to change a system as complex as U.S. healthcare. So whether you're a healthcare entrepreneur, a medical professional, or just someone passionate about the future of healthcare, this podcast is your backstage pass to the minds shaping the industry. Now let's have Shawnnah tell us a little bit about themselves. Welcome, Shawnnah, to the K in Clarity podcast. For the people listening, can you give a brief overview of who you are and what it is you do?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm Shawnnah Monterrey. I'm the CEO of Beanstock Ventures. I founded the company back in 2018. We are a full-service medical device regulatory provider, and we are accredited by the FDA as a third-party review organization.
Perfect. As you may know, typically we like to do an icebreaker here before we get into the questions. And so my first icebreaker for you is if you could create an AI regulatory oracle, that could really predict and understand, FDA compliance, what would it be and what would it look like as well?
I would create a bias risk radar. And so it would analyze training data sets to flag underrepresented populations. It would look at clinical edge cases. It would help cross-reference intended use, patient demographics, device performance, and use real-world evidence. And then it would continuously compare the model's cohort against newly acquired data for world population health integration. And so it would be used before pre-marketing to help de-risk FDA approval.
Speaking about AI as well, I know that you actually helped create an AI-based device for glaucoma at Carl Zeiss. What made you feel so confident, and what did you see that made you actually want to implement this in the early 2000s as, a premier technology?
Yeah, so we developed early detection diagnostics AI in the early 2000s, and we actually achieved approval. So when you think about it back then, like the data was giving us information that couldn't be readily seen by the eye. And so the GDX was a scanning laser polarimeter. And we had very rich nerve fiber image data, and the AI allowed us to extract features from those images that humans couldn't readily. And we got superior performance, including increased sensitivity and specificity compared to humans. It was more than just hardware, right? So the hardware was able to do the imaging, but we really needed AI to bridge the gap behind deriving meaningful clinical insights, which in this case was glaucoma detection from the actual image data itself.
Why do you think maybe there's so much bias when it comes down to these things?
The bias in terms of the results?
Correct.
It has to do with the data. And so we had a really large data set. I mean, this was hundreds of thousands of patient population based data. And so with the training algorithm, it was kind of then condensed, but we actually had different cohorts. And what was interesting at the time, like when we sold into specific countries, a lot of times the countries would require that our training set was using their population. Like in China, we couldn't even sell into China unless we had an Asian-based population, which was very specific to Chinese ancestry. And then until that was being done, we didn't even understand the subtleties with the diagnostics. And actually the detection was much different for the Chinese population than other populations. And I think the reason for the bias isn't just data in, data out. It's expensive, right? It's expensive to develop a very diverse patient population that has the right demographics to actually train the algorithm. And then you have to then validate the algorithm with a separate set of data, right? So it can be very costly.
Gotcha. What do you think is something maybe that you guys did really well in the early 2000s that maybe people aren't thinking about today in the AI market, and, your thoughts there?
We locked the algorithm intentionally because FDA wasn't really keen. We didn't even market it as AI. We didn't even think that was a big deal. We just knew that AI was suitable for the problem that we were trying to solve. And so we locked the algorithm. And then what we would do is when we actually brought in new data to retrain the algorithm or improve the algorithm, then we did another 510(k) filing with the FDA. FDA now is kind of coming to terms with that, and they created what's called a predetermined change control plan, or PCCP. And what that allows medical device manufacturers to do is to establish basically their plans for future training and future extensions of the actual algorithm. And so basically, let's say it doesn't work well in a certain population, you would clear your device and exclude that population, and then you would then follow on with another update to your product with an additional population to increase the breadth of your product. And so that was something we understood really early on. So we intentionally locked the algorithm. We couldn't have an adaptive, continuously learning algorithm.
Nice way to be preemptive.
Yeah, exactly.
Tying it to there as well, I know with your 510 clearance, you guys are really great at fast tracking. I know we spoke about this briefly. How do you really anticipate the evolving compliance demands, especially when it comes down to machine learning systems and everything that you're seeing in the market?
Gosh, I think that you want to understand, the data diversity. So at least we learned very early that data diversity was everything. So to clear diagnostic, the accuracy hinged on training with diverse represented data sets. So if you look at now today, FDA has the emphasis on data equity and subgroup analysis, and it's the same issue we saw 25 years ago. I also mentioned having it fixed so that we can have adaptive learning, that we locked it originally. And then what we did is we revalidated with the same methodology that we used for the prior submission. And then we understand the difference right now between like support tools and atomic tools. And at that point, the system we positioned was a diagnostic. It was a diagnostic decision support application, and it wasn't autonomous. We had plans for autonomous screening tools specifically to say, yes, you have glaucoma, or no, you don't, with just a press of a button, but FDA wasn't ready. And so the first stepping stone was diagnostics. And this was a long time ago, and eye care has further on that innovation as that first stepping stone. So you'll see the first autonomous cleared device by the FDA is an eye care. And that's because that innovation that happened 25 years ago was the first stepping stone.
Do you see any maybe other industries that it's touching maybe through your work as well?
Definitely cancer detection. You can see that. I mean, it's across the board. I think for in every aspect, there's a lot of data, a lot of clinical data out there, and people are just taking in the data and then running algorithms to kind of see if they can detect or derive new clinical insights. The issue that I am seeing though is with startups doing that, not understanding the actual science behind it. And I'm not talking about the science behind the AI, right? But the clinical implications to make sure that they train the algorithm appropriately. Right. And so, what are the characteristics? Like for our device, for example, the images could be of poor quality, right? If it's an image based system, you could have outlier cases, like really extreme severe cases or really kind of acute cases that you can't really detect easily. And you want to make sure that you train the algorithm with those edge cases.
Can you as well tell the audience a little bit about, your work at Beanstock Ventures, what makes you guys so great at, accelerating others, and as well how you guys really utilize your pre-mortem strategy to identify showstoppers in the market?
So we do like regulatory assessments, but prior to that, we make sure that there's a sound regulatory strategy. So originally, we didn't realize that that was the gap in industry. We went straight into let's look at what you have and make sure you're ready for submission. And we started finding out that our clients didn't even have a regulatory pathway. They had multiple indications potentially. They didn't know if they were de novo or 510K or even maybe a PMA. And so what we did is we built like a 4-prong approach. Prong one is defining the regulatory strategy. If they have a sound regulatory strategy, we vet that and make sure we're in agreement. Once the regulatory strategy is defined, then we figure out what's the next steps. Sometimes it could be seeking a breakthrough designation. Sometimes it could be meeting with the FDA with a Q-sub to look at our clinical study or to make a determination whether it's going to be class 2 or de novo. After we do that, then we do what's called the regulatory assessment. So that's kind of like our first line of defense. So before our clients submit, we use our technical expertise and our regulatory expertise to look at what they've done thus far, right? We look at anything from their architecture, specifications, cybersecurity, data models, usability testing, you name it. And what we do is we do a gap assessment to determine their readiness for submission. We have very hardened templates that we've used. We've served over 100 clients so far. And with those clients, we've basically hardened kind of our best practice, right? So we have templates that we use for FDA submission that we offer to our clients that have been through FDA approval. And these are technical templates. They're very sophisticated. It takes in the FDA guidances and also the mostly widely used recognized consensus standards. It takes that information and harmonizes it into a template that then is suitable for either a tech filing for Europe or some other country or region, or FDA using their eStar template.
Gotcha. I know we had discussed as well that a lot of companies really fail to reach, at least 6 out of 7 fail to reach, FDA clearance. What do you think is something that you guys do, especially with your accelerator layer, that help increase based upon everything that you guys had mentioned in your strategy?
Yeah, I think I'll start with like 3 reasons and then I'll go into the accelerator that we have, which is part of Beanstock Ventures. So the first one is not understanding what's necessary from a regulatory perspective. So they'll focus on the science or the clinical aspect, right? But they won't really understand the rest of what's actually required. And so even though the clinical and the science and technology is like 80% of the work, it's not 80% of the submission. 80% of a regulatory submission is all the technical documentation. It doesn't mean it's more important. It just means that that's kind of the status quo. And so that's one area. The other thing is that they run out of funding and they don't work to build in their regulatory strategy early. And they start finding out that investors are really interested in them getting approval because investors currently kind of look at the regulatory burden as being very expensive. They'll go default and assume a clinical study is necessary. That might not be the case. And so they'll basically put their foot forward and say, we're not going to fund until you get cleared. Right. And then that creates a circular issue because now they don't have funding to actually clear. And really, it's because they used every part of their original funding for these other aspects of development and overlooked the regulatory piece. And then the other thing is they submit prematurely. They try to do it themselves. So unless they have someone on their team, like part of their team that has done it before, I do not recommend doing it yourself, right? And that person on the team just had to have cleared a device at least once to be successful, to be useful. But if they haven't done it before, they're really underestimating. And so when they go ahead and do the submission themselves or with very little guidance because they don't want to invest, they don't see the value in investing, or they are not able to invest, we see them as then losing 2-3 years of their submission, which is unfortunate because they did the incorrect study. Now they have to redo a clinical study, right? That's detrimental to the businesses. And so the way our accelerators help is we're 1 in 7 accredited by the FDA as a third-party review organization. So we have very keen and direct insight on what's required for these submissions. So most startups, again, will build first and ask regulatory questions later. We like to put that in the forefront. Build the regulatory strategy. It's part of your business strategy. Those are things we like to focus on to improve. The other thing is we focus on high potentials for the studio. So we purposely vet the startups that we believe are 12 to 18 months, regardless what they believe. So we go through assessment criteria to determine the likelihood of them having FDA success based on their product and their technology and the team caliber. And then we fit them with our expertise to help guide them through that process to hit that milestone. We also pair them with investment. So part of our venture studio is to ensure that they invest properly, because what we're seeing, as I mentioned before, is they're underestimating the investment for regulatory. So they're undervaluing the services and not putting enough resources for that actual activity.
Gotcha. I know you touched on those 3 certain problems that leaders face. What is the biggest one, and why do you think that is?
Gosh, I think the biggest one is not investing. And I was asked this yesterday, actually, so I had some thoughts around it, was not basically undervaluing the investment needed for regulatory. And I think that's because a lot of startups understand how much it costs to do a clinical study. I mean, there's data, everything's published out there. You can consult with numerous people that understand the cost to do clinical study. Everyone knows kind of the cost of development or R&D, whether you're outsourcing it to India or doing it in-house or, using a US-based firm, like those costs are known. I think with the regulatory, there's not enough data out there to show the value. And I think it has to do with a lot of the regulatory consultants are boutique, so they're kind of one-off, and there's no big agency or firm that actually does a really good job. I'm not to say there aren't any, right? But they can seem almost prohibitive in terms of their cost model, and their perceived value is low, right? So I think it has to do with understanding the need up front, because when startups come to us, many times they've already submitted and they have deficiencies and they know that they can't resubmit without significant effort, and then they come to us, right? So then they see the value. So I think it's a matter of us as regulatory experts and consultants kind of being able to convince and portray that value. And I think as an industry, we've had a hard time doing that.
What would be your suggestion to leaders, to maybe be preemptive instead of already submitting? What should they have probably done in that case?
I think if we start developing like published case studies and just start having more data out there to raise awareness and increase transparency, I think that'll help. If we start singing the same tune, I also think that would help. I think it doesn't help industry when we come in as regulatory consultants and kind of, let's say, come in low on purpose just to get the deal, and then end up upselling and upselling and upselling. And then eventually they spend $150K, which they should have probably known and spent up front, right? And I think that's just because people are trying to get a hook. And so when I'm sometimes comparing my services, I have very fixed fees and very fixed ranges, and I expose those up front. I'm like, this is generally where you are. This is basically how much it's going to cost. I don't do a bait and switch. I kind of bring them along that process so that then when the time comes, they can come back. And if they end up telling me, well, so-and-so said they can do it cheaper, et cetera, faster, then I let them go with the person that says they could do it cheaper and faster, because I know I can't, right? And I don't want to undervalue my services. So I think as an industry, if we looked at having that value on our services and making sure that what we're representing is actually consistent with what's going to be required, I think eventually that the industry will understand how much regulatory services actually do cost and what they would need to allocate for that.
I also want to tie into this, I guess, how do you balance, the perspective of the stiff, maybe review process of the FDA with, very adaptive algorithms and how you kind of go about it in the regulatory process?
Yeah, I think the first one, which I mentioned before, is creating the change control plan to tell FDA how your algorithm is getting released, how it's going to adapt, and how you're going to validate it. That allows you to get approval up front so you don't necessarily have to resubmit. The other thing that you can do to be more adaptive is to segregate the architecture. So you can focus on the common components, which I like to apply the 80 rule to everything I see in regulatory and even design. Like 80% of your architecture is probably going to be a little bit more static. That doesn't mean you're not going to make features, but it's not going to be dynamic in the way we talk about AI in terms of an adaptive algorithm. So if you're able to separate out that component, then you can focus on having the appropriate rigor there. The other thing is just treating monitoring and versioning as just part of the product. And so I envision, like going back to the kind of Oracle question, like us building in validators that can actually like basically online as the algorithm becomes adaptive and as the algorithm starts changing, like self-validate itself to make sure that it's still meeting the same sensitivity and specificity and it's not introducing any bias, right? And then if that's good, then it can kind of roll out those changes so it can be more adaptive. That's like future thinking, but I feel like it's really low-hanging fruit. We have tools that automate testing that we can just apply to software online or even do it in a sandbox as part of development and then eventually roll it out. So I think there's things that we can do now, we're just not doing it. And I think it's just because we haven't educated industry enough to be receptive to those ideas.
I know, speaking on the topic of neglect, you noted once in our conversation as well that, startups typically neglect reimbursement strategy. And
Yes.
so what are maybe one or two metrics that you think they could be looking at to really help reach patients post-clearance? What would that be?
Yeah, I think the first one's easy, right? Do they have a reimbursement code or not? The hurdle to get reimbursement code can be quite high. So just because you clear your device under a 510(k) doesn't mean it's automatically reimbursable. And then the other one is what I want to call like a distribution pathway or a marketing pathway. Like getting into hospital systems is very complicated, and each hospital system has its own set of requirements that may not have anything to do with what FDA is expecting. They might even have product changes, like features that are very specific. And when you get into a hospital system, they basically have like a checklist, right? Especially if you're competing against something that's already there, then they're going to have a supplier checklist and they're going to go through that and determine whether you can enter the hospital or not, just on that checklist to start, right? Then you obviously need adoption. For over-the-counter home devices, like customer adoption is really important. And I think we tend to underestimate the amount of money and effort is needed for appropriate communication for raising awareness around the product. Right. And I didn't mention any sort of evidence to basically show the value increasing in clinical care, efficiency, justifying the cost, that type of thing as well.
I was speaking to another leader, and there's a lot of focus as well with patients and their data, which is, I think, absolutely critical. But another thing that they mentioned is how maybe patients also relate to their devices, particularly medical device, obviously. And so what do you think about those thoughts? What that future could maybe look like? Do you think it's a good, use case? Just what are your thoughts in general?
I actually think there's a shift where we care about our health more than we ever had. And I think it's kind of started with, I forget what that online doctor is, right? MedMD or something like that. And I think people started researching, like, I have these symptoms and maybe I have this disease, right? And they're taking it to the extreme because there's like some very rare diseases that obviously they don't have. But what you're starting to see is that integration with people wanting to know like their blood pressure and their heart rate, like for fitness purposes or to tweak their routine. Functional medicine is becoming really popular. And so I think as we start enabling more technology that's more suitable for an end user and easy to use, I guarantee that we're going to have more self-monitoring and self-reporting. I'm doing it now. That's new for me, and I feel more empowered. And I don't want to say it's a lack of the healthcare system, but I feel more empowered kind of looking at my test data and then determining what's actually needed. For example, I had extreme fatigue and nobody can figure it out, right? And I had medicine that I didn't need. And then finally, with the right test, I figured out I had an iron deficiency. And so I think with that aspect, I think people are going to start taking their health into their own hands, which means they will be more receptive to technology.
Switching gears a little bit, I know as well you've served on the NIH review proposals. And so what is maybe a common flaw that you think really sinks innovative, med tech proposals?
One would be there's no commercialization plan. So that's been changed recently. So I'm on the CRP grant review, which is a commercialization readiness pilot review. But with that, there's a lack of focus on the actual commercialization of the science. And I think with that review in particular, the reviewers generally are not with business background. They're generally scientists. Like I'm probably like one of the only reviewers that have a business development background, right? Like more pragmatic versus science. And I think that's where one of the shifts need to be made. But I think for the medical device innovations to be successful, they really need to focus on beyond the innovation, right? How is it going to get into the hands of the users? The other thing I mentioned before, this is the same with grant reviews, is they skip the regulatory strategy like entirely, right? So they do a clinical study and they're not accounting for what FDA is going to require for them to clear, and then they're going to have to go and repeat that study. It doesn't matter how robust the study is. What matters is what FDA cares about and what they're looking for as it relates to that product. Another big one, which is huge, is not just the reviewers lack business development expertise, but so do the submitters, right? And so the innovators are generally professors or scientists, super smart, really great innovation, but they don't have the background needed to get it into a form like engineering, like a product development format that's suitable for the end user, let alone market, distribute, manufacture, etc. And so usually their team is lacking. And so I think once they start getting to a certain level of showing safety and efficacy and past feasibility, it's time to rebuild or build a new team in terms of getting the product out to market. The skill sets are completely different.
Why do you think, the go-to-market and the commercialization, of these tech and the devices as well are so difficult?
I think because if you look at the big industries, right, majority of medical device manufacturing companies are the big players, right? And the big players tend to acquire the small players. And really the whole reason for that is because the big players can't innovate, but the small players don't have the distribution channel, the branding, the relationship, the name recognition. And I think it's just, easier said than done. The medium-sized companies that I have seen that are very successful have well-established relationships in the distribution, whether it's a hospital system, multiple hospital systems, a distributor partner, even partnering with some of these big med tech companies. A really popular strategy is partnering with pharma. And so I think it's just not spending enough time understanding that aspect of the business, right? Understanding like, great, I have a really great medical device, but it's worth nothing if it can't reach the patient. So distribution and the business development activities shouldn't be underestimated. Patient is you can't do that until you get cleared, right? So then it goes back to not being FDA cleared sooner than later and not having a regulatory strategy well defined, right? So something that should take 5 years from start to finish ends up taking 8 or 10.
Interesting. Speaking of relationships as well, I know you have a grassroots network of, 10,000 professionals. And so how do you guys really leverage knowledge sharing, to shortcut, regulatory learning curves and really bring about things to market, that people need?
So it basically connects the decision makers with real world insights, right? And so it's not academic, it's actually real world experience. And so the people that are on there are other medical device manufacturers, and it was built by medical device manufacturers, my team. It allows them to kind of get grounded in things like submission timelines, feedback that has been received from FDA, seeing how other people had handled certain deficiencies, and just getting insights into others' experience. It allows multiple lessons learned across like just the whole ecosystem. And this can save months in trial and error. And it also just supports a culture of support and not competition, right? We're all here with the same goals. And I think it kind of opens that up and allows others to kind of foster and improve that communication. And I think it starts even bleeding into the gaps in the areas that I mentioned in terms of like creative ideas around distribution channels, marketing techniques, over the counter versus, selling into a hospital system, stuff like that.
Also, how are you, probably thinking about designing certain frameworks to really anticipate, future regulatory landscapes and what that looks like as well?
Yeah, so we have a few frameworks. So one is our design templates and training. That's a framework that we use. That's our grassroots, part of our grassroots community. We are starting to train an ML model for either populating the templates. We want to see how well the AI model works, but ultimately what we want to do is have it as a regulatory readiness checker. So basically, our clients would submit their package, whatever shape, form it's in terms of assessing whether it's ready and where some of the FDA submission gaps are going to be. So that's our idea for the future, because we've done over 100 projects and we have more clients coming in that have failed submissions. And what we want to do is kind of train the algorithm such a way to detect those failures early. We also have Bedrock. Bedrock is our sample to answer solution. It's basically clinical decision or diagnostic software. It's built architecturally with the 80/20 rule. So 80% of it's designed and developed under design controls, including documentation, including cyber security testing, etc. And then it allows for that 20% of innovation to be factored in. And so it's significantly faster. We've built a clinical application that was completely custom for our clients using their custom algorithm in less than 3 months, completely clinical grade. And so we believe in reusable. I've been working on products for many years, and I always see that there's a lot of repeat and similarities in terms of the product design expectation and then the lessons learned, right? And I see companies over and over learning from scratch when they don't necessarily need to. And it's almost like they want to. It's kind of interesting. So kind of breaking that to say, look, like your expertise should be on the IP. Like focus on what's special, what makes your device special and unique, right? Focus on the science. Everything else is like can be standardized.
I know as well, speaking about the future, you work at the Launchpad. And so what's maybe something that you're instilling in the future of next gen medical engineers for them to implement, build great products that can really solve problems and, help patients?
So I actually teach a course there, and what I focus on is like the regulatory fundamentals. So they cover design controls as part of that, but what I end up focusing on is the regulatory pathway. And we focus a lot on the intended use, being very clear, very narrow, and trying to gear them towards the lowest bar to clearance. That may not be their breakthrough AI idea or cancer diagnostic or whatever they're moving towards, right? Every medical device, for the most part, has like a base technology that usually has an early entry point into the market. And so I try to get them there purposely so that they can understand what it takes to clear the device. Then they can get funding. And then with the funding, then they can work on future indications. Not only will the registration allow for funding, but then they can actually start marketing and start testing the product market fit and start establishing partnerships early while they work on their bigger, more innovative kind of idea, right? It allows them to start collecting data as well. Like FDA allows real world evidence. So you can collect data outside, as long as it's under, proper controls and you vetted the data, you can use it to train your algorithms or even validate your product. And so that's what I like to instill in them early is like, let's figure out what the lowest bar to enter the market is and then add on from there.
That's beautiful. Before going on to our lightning round, my last question for you here is Beanstock, and especially everything you guys do in med device regulatory process, it's hard work, right? It's probably not, what always people think of the most exciting piece, of healthcare, but I think it's a critical piece and component. And so what do you really hope is something that you guys can help achieve in changing the systematic processes in the next 10 years to bring about innovation, be bold as well, and bring about the change that people want to see?
Yeah, I think the big thing is standardization. Also being able to change the mindset around regulatory. Like a regulatory strategy is part of a business strategy, right? We develop business strategies very early. The regulatory strategy should be part and parcel to that business strategy. So changing that mindset to start the regulatory process sooner than later. Also, just looking at kind of the reuse potential that we have. I mean, there's so many guidances and standards and regulations out there just for one aspect of designing a product. And it's unnecessary, right? Every country will create their own. And so it'd be great if we can develop a way to kind of take all those and harmonize them and then put it into a tool that if someone's actually going to a global market can look at their design documentation and all the activities that they have performed and determine suitability for each of those markets, right? So it kind of goes back to that, audit ready kind of assessment tool where you just kind of plop in what you have, give a description about your product, and then it tells you, okay, here's all the gaps that you're going to have and here's how to solve it. Right. And I think that'll go a long way, because otherwise people are kind of going blind, and reviewing the submission by hand is very costly and time consuming. And that's what we do now. Like, we do the reviews, we're very meticulous, we're very detailed. Then we focus on the points that actually matter. But if we can get that other piece automated, then we can just focus on like the areas of concern, right? And not everything else that's kind of status quo.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now it's time for the lightning round. So my first question for you is, what are your thoughts in helping bridging and improving healthcare access from everything that you've seen in your years of experience?
So way back when, it was workflow compatibility, workflow efficiencies. Today is workflow compatibility and workflow efficiencies. And so the key thing is figuring out how to integrate your product into the existing clinical workflow. If it doesn't integrate well, it's very likely not going to be used. And there's so many inefficiencies in the clinical workflow. Anything you can do to speed up time, you can get patients, their medicine faster, you can diagnose or triage patients quicker, right? Whatever we can do to kind of speed that up in a way that's well integrated into the way the clinicians currently work is very helpful. I think changing the paradigm and how they work is going to be much slower, because there's processes and procedures in place like in these hospital systems. So it's about building technology that works within that complicated ecosystem that makes it really easy to use. And that's a hard thing to do. But it's been a problem from way back when, and I still think it's an issue.
In your opinion as well, maybe what's the biggest misconception about fast track designation?
Yeah, so breakthrough designation does not necessarily speed things up. You still have to do the work, and it doesn't bypass the regulations. If anything, you get more specificity from FDA on what's actually required. Doesn't mean it's going to slow it down, but you still have to do the work, right? And so I think the misconception is you have breakthrough, right? It's going to automatically be reimbursable, and then it's going to be sped through the system. It still relies on the medical device manufacturer's team to actually be the speed. Right? FDA is not going to be the speed. They'll answer your questions. You get to meet with them periodically, right? And get very specific questions answered, but you need to know what those questions are and what steps you need to take. So our clients that end up being most efficient actually have breakthrough designation and work with FDA and work with us, right? So they couple the two things together there. So this is important. So right now there's new administration with the FDA, and they're thinking about getting automatic reimbursement if you're a breakthrough. So that would be breakthrough. Well, I mean, that would be very compelling, because then the reimbursement is kind of doesn't become the hindrance, because the breakthrough devices, they have a certain classification in terms of like immediate help for something. They are looking for things that are completely new and innovative, hence it's called breakthrough, that's going to change the standard of care.
Lastly, what is the emerging technology that you think is really going to help rethink and how FDA is going to rethink its processes in the future, and what the application of it would be?
I think it's going to be like, imagine the convergence of VR, robotics, and AI, right? Machine learning. So let's apply it to like a surgical procedure, for example. So you have the VR headset, you have AI learning from the anatomy of the patient, and then you have the surgical robot acting on those changes or information. It's not even changes, information that it's seeing real time, right? How do you go about regulating that? And so static performance testing is not going to be sufficient. And so I think we need to figure out a way in how to have adaptive validation checks within a system, or safeguards within a system, so that it can be adaptive within certain parameters. And that just goes not just with the regulatory aspect, but also the design and implementation. And then you start thinking about, okay, who's in control, right? Is it the surgeon, the robot, the algorithm? So we need to understand how to evolve that, to understand where those controls need to be put in place. And so it's going to be a very dynamic clinical ecosystem. So eventually it's going to happen. The technology is already there, right? It's just getting, and it's used in research. Like research hospitals will be using very advanced, innovative systems because they can use it and they can innovate within their hospital system, right? It's like getting it out to the masses, which is the problem. That's when the FDA regulation comes into play. Once you start wanting to distribute that solution outside of that hospital system, then it becomes a medical device and you become a medical device manufacturer. And so getting that out and about is going to be even more challenging when I don't even think we have a handle on AI yet. Cybersecurity, even right now, I think is the guidance. While I respect it technically, I think it's too rigorous, right? There's no stratification for the risk of the device within cyber. It's like you need to satisfy these 12 requirements. They're not even requirements, like these 12 artifacts, right, need to be satisfied. It's a big portion of the submission, and you may be very low cyber risk. You may be very low patient risk, but the requirements are the same. And I think, again, they have high technical merit, but the rigor is not adjusted or not suitable for what some of these devices are actually doing.
Shawnnah, thanks for your time, for your thoughts. I know we touched a lot on regulatory compliance and strategy. What are some maybe final thoughts that you have for the audience as well?
Gosh, I think just to kind of sum it up, like do not underestimate the time needed and the effort needed to come up with a well-defined regulatory strategy and to execute on that. And don't wait till you think you're 3 months to submit to actually start on the strategy. It's too late. And if you think you're 3 months from submitting, you can actually be 18 months away. And that would be detrimental to your business potentially and to your investors. So make sure it's not an afterthought.
Perfect. Thank you again, Shawnnah, for your time. Where can people choose to connect with you as well if they choose to do so?
Our website, I'm highly responsive. It'll actually get to me. They can set up a 30-minute meeting with me. So if they go to www.beanstockventures.com and they just fill out a quick contact form and then they get access to my calendar. And I'm more than happy to meet with anyone for 30 minutes free of charge. They get tons of insight. We'll actually delve into their product and kind of start looking at what their regulatory strategy might be.
Well, Shawnnah, thank you again for your time on the K in Clarity podcast.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Of course.
Bye.